Hey there, welcome to Mr. Cozy True Crime Stories. Tonight, we're diving into 2 hours of gripping true crime cases. Real stories of mystery, betrayal, and cold-blooded crimes, all set against the soothing backdrop of rain. It's the perfect blend of calm and unsettling. If these cases draw you in, tap that like button, share with your fellow true crime lovers, and subscribe to join our curious community. I'm always wondering, where are you tuning in from? And what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. Now settle in, and let's dig into the darkness. Story 1. In Bentonville, Arkansas, where the rolling Ozark foothills meet quiet suburban neighborhoods, autumn carries the promise of cooler days and the slow drift of leaves from maple trees. It is a city known more for its corporate headquarters than for tragedy. A place where families settle to build ordinary lives filled with school drop-offs, weekend soccer games, and the rhythms of routine. In the fall of 2012, one such life, small, resilient, and full of hope despite everything it had already endured, was about to be cut heartbreakingly short. Jersey Diane Bridgman was born on November 14, 2006, into a world that should have cradled her with care, but instead tested her from the very beginning. She was a child with bright eyes and a spirit that somehow remained cheerful even when the adults around her failed in ways that are difficult to comprehend. Those who knew her in her 6 short years often remarked on her ability to smile, to laugh, to find joy in small things, even when her circumstances suggested she had every reason not to. Her story is one of survival that should have led to healing, but instead became a haunting reminder of how vulnerable the youngest among us truly are. Her early years were marked by the kind of instability that leaves deep scars. After her parents divorced, Jersey went to live with her father, David Bridgman, and his new wife, Jana. What happened behind the closed doors of that home would eventually shock a community and raise urgent questions about how children slip through the cracks of systems designed to protect them. David and Jana Bridgman claimed that Jersey wandered at night, that she got into medication, and that something drastic needed to be done to keep her safe. Their solution was neither safe nor humane. They chained their daughter to a dresser, restraining her like a prisoner in her own bedroom. The image of a small child, tethered in the dark, unable to move freely, is one that defies the most basic understanding of parental love. Yet it happened night after night, while Jersey's pleas, if she made them, went unheard or ignored. When authorities finally learned of the abuse, the public response was immediate and fierce. People struggled to understand how such treatment could be justified, how anyone could look at a young child and decide that chains were the answer. David and Jana Bridgman were arrested and charged with false imprisonment, permitting abuse, and endangering the welfare of a minor. Both eventually pleaded guilty, an admission that brought at least some measure of accountability. David was sentenced to 18 years in prison, while Jana received 12. The sentences were significant, reflecting the severity of what they had done, but for Jersey, the damage was already inscribed on her young heart. With her father and stepmother behind bars, Jersey was placed in the custody of her mother, Desiree. It was a new beginning, or at least it was meant to be. Desiree worked hard to provide for her daughters, Jersey and her younger sister, often returning home late from shifts that stretched long into the evening. She relied on neighbors for help, on the kindness of people she believed she could trust. In a neighborhood where front doors were often left unlocked and children played together in yards that bled into one another, that trust did not seem misplaced. Among those neighbors were Zachary and Amanda Holly, a couple who lived nearby and who had offered, on more than one occasion, to help with childcare. Zachary Holly, born in 1984, was 28 years old in the fall of 2012, a man who seemed helpful and dependable to a single mother managing the demands of work and family. He and his wife had stepped in as babysitters, watching Jersey and her sister when Desiree's schedule required it. On the surface, it was the kind of community support that many families depend on, a small network of care that makes daily life manageable. On the night of November 19, 2012, Desiree came home late once again. The Hollis had been watching the girls, and when their mother arrived, they helped tuck Jersey and her sister into bed. The house settled into the quiet hum of nighttime, the soft breathing of sleeping children, the creak of old wood adjusting to the cold, the distant hum of traffic on nearby streets. There was no reason for Desiree to believe that this night would be different from any other, no warning that the morning would bring a terror she could never have anticipated. When the sun rose on November 20th, Desiree went to wake her daughters. Her younger child was there, still curled beneath the blankets. But Jersey's bed was empty. Panic moves through a parent in stages. First the confusion, the belief that there must be a simple explanation, that the child is hiding or has wandered to another room. Then the frantic search, calling out a name with increasing urgency, checking closets and bathrooms and any space a small body might fit. Finally, the crushing realization that something is wrong, that the world has shifted in a terrible, irreversible way. Desiree called for help, and among the first people she reached out to were the Hollis, the neighbors who had been so kind, who had just hours earlier helped put her daughters to bed. They came quickly, joining the search, their faces reflecting the same fear that was now consuming Jersey's mother. The neighborhood mobilized. Doors were knocked on, yards were searched, voices called out Jersey's name in the cold morning air. But there was no answer. Later that day, the search ended in the worst possible way. Jersey was found in a vacant home in the same neighborhood, a place that should have been nothing more than an empty structure awaiting new occupants. Instead, it had become the site of an unspeakable crime. Her small body was discovered naked, a violation that spoke to the darkest intentions. The medical examination would reveal that she had been assaulted and suffocated, strangled by her own pajama bottoms. She was 6 years old. The community reeled. Parents held their children closer, locked doors that had previously stood open, and struggled to understand how such evil could exist so close to home. For Desiree, the grief was compounded by a mother's worst fear, that she had trusted the wrong people, that in seeking help, she had inadvertently placed her daughter in harm's way. There is no preparation for such a realization, no roadmap for navigating the guilt and sorrow that follows. Authorities moved swiftly. Zachary Holly, the helpful neighbor who had been among the first to assist in the search, became the focus of their investigation. He was cooperative, at least initially, providing a sample of his DNA and answering questions. Perhaps he believed that his outward assistance would deflect suspicion, or perhaps he underestimated the power of forensic science to uncover the truth. Whatever his calculations, they proved to be his undoing. The forensic evidence was damning. DNA analysis linked Holly directly to the crime, placing him at the scene and connecting him to the assault on Jersey. The illusion of the concerned neighbor shattered, replaced by the reality of a predator who had used proximity and trust as tools to access his victim. He was arrested and charged with kidnapping, physical assault, murder, and residential burglary. The burglary charge stemmed from his unlawful entry into Desiree's home to abduct Jersey while she slept, a cold and calculated act that demonstrated premeditation. Holly pleaded not guilty. For nearly 3 years, the case moved through the legal system, with pretrial motions, evidence hearings, and the slow grind of justice. The prosecution prepared to argue that the forensic evidence left no reasonable doubt about Holly's guilt. The defense sought to challenge the evidence, to raise questions, to find any angle that might create uncertainty in the minds of jurors. But the science was clear, and the facts were undeniable. In May 2015, the case went to trial. For Desiree and her family, sitting through the proceedings meant reliving the worst day of their lives in excruciating detail. They heard testimony about the condition in which Jersey was found, about the forensic analysis that confirmed the physical assault, about the manner of her death. They watched as the man who had been welcomed into their home, who had been trusted with their most precious responsibility, sat in the defendant's chair and maintained his innocence. On May 20th, 2015, the jury delivered its verdict, guilty on all counts. The relief in the courtroom was palpable, but it was a hollow kind of relief, the sort that comes not from restored happiness, but from the smallest measure of accountability. The sentencing phase followed, and the jury, having heard the full scope of the crime and its impact, recommended the most severe punishment available under Arkansas law. Zachary Hawley was sentenced to death for the capital murder conviction, along with 2 life terms and an additional 20 years for the other charges. The death sentence reflected the jury's conclusion that the crime was so heinous, so devoid of any mitigating factors, that the ultimate penalty was warranted. It also reflected the particular horror of crimes against children, the recognition that Jersey had been utterly defenseless, stolen from her bed and subjected to unimaginable cruelty by someone who had been entrusted with her care. But even with the conviction and sentencing, the case did not end. Hawley continued to assert his innocence, a position he maintained despite the overwhelming evidence against him. In 2019, he filed petition, a legal motion claiming that he had received inadequate counsel from his attorneys during his trial. Such petitions are common in death penalty cases, part of the exhaustive appeals process designed to ensure that no person is wrongly executed. Hawley's petition argued that his defense team had failed him, that with better representation, the outcome might have been different. As of the present day, Hawley remains on death row, his case continuing to wind through the appellate courts. The wheels of justice turn slowly, particularly in capital cases, where every procedural safeguard is scrutinized and every claim of error must be carefully considered. For Jersey's family, each new filing, each new hearing, is a reminder that closure remains elusive. Jersey's story resonated far beyond the courtroom. It became a focal point for broader conversations about child protection, about the failures that allowed her to suffer abuse at the hands of her father and stepmother, and about the systems that are supposed to identify and protect vulnerable children before tragedy strikes. Advocates pointed to her case as evidence that more must be done: better training for those who work with children, more resources for overwhelmed social services, stricter oversight of families with histories of abuse. There were also painful questions about how predators operate, about how someone like Zachary Hawley could present as a helpful neighbor while harboring such dark intentions. The case underscored the uncomfortable truth that danger does not always come from strangers lurking in shadows. Sometimes it comes from familiar faces, from people who have earned trust and know how to exploit it. Despite everything she endured, the abuse, the fear, the ultimate betrayal, those who knew Jersey remembered her as a happy and cheerful girl. It is one of the most heartbreaking details of her story, that even after being chained in the dark, even after being failed by the people who should have protected her most fiercely, she still found reasons to smile. That resilience, that stubborn brightness, makes her loss all the more unbearable. She deserved a life filled with birthdays and first days of school, with friendships and dreams and all the ordinary milestones that should mark a childhood. Instead, her life was measured in just 6 years, and her story became a cautionary tale about trust, vulnerability, and the imperative to protect the innocent. In Bentonville today, the vacant home where Jersey was found has long since been occupied by new residents who may or may not know the history that unfolded within its walls. The neighborhood has changed, as neighborhoods do, with new families moving in and old ones moving on. But for those who were there in November 2012, the memory remains sharp. Parents still think twice before leaving their children with anyone, still feel a tightness in their chests when a child is out of sight for even a moment. Desiree carries a burden no mother should have to bear, living with the knowledge that the help she sought for her daughters led to unimaginable tragedy. Jersey's case also continues to be studied by those working in criminal justice and child protection. It appears in training materials for social workers, in discussions about risk assessment, and in debates about how to better identify and intervene in situations where children are at risk. Her name is invoked not as a statistic, but as a reminder of a real child whose life mattered, whose suffering should never be forgotten, and whose death demands that we do better. There is no neat resolution to this story, no moment where the pain is fully resolved or the questions fully answered. Zachary Hawley sits on death row, his execution on hold as appeals continue. Jersey's family continues to grieve, marking birthdays that will never come and milestones that will never be reached. The community continues to grapple with the knowledge that such horror unfolded in their midst, in the quiet space between houses where children once played without fear. What remains, beyond the legal battles and the policy debates, is the memory of a little girl who deserved so much more than she received. Jersey Bridgman's life was short, marked by suffering that no child should ever know, but it was also a life of remarkable resilience. She smiled in the face of cruelty. She found joy even in darkness. And though she is gone, her story endures, a call to vigilance, a demand for justice, and a reminder that every child's life is precious, fragile, and worthy of our fiercest protection. Story 2. The alarm on Samantha Murphy's phone had not even gone off yet on the morning of February 4th, 2024. She was already awake. That was just the kind of person she was, a woman who did not need to be pushed into the day, who rose to meet it on her own terms. The night before, a Sunday, she had sat at a family dinner and talked about running. She told them she had been training hard, pushing her mileage further each week, building towards something bigger than the local park trails she had already mastered. She had a plan for the following morning: 14 kilometers through Woo-Woo-Kurrung Regional Park, a sweep of native bushland on the southeastern edge of Ballarat, Victoria. She was going to run 14 kilometers before most of the city was even awake. Samantha was 51 years old, and she wore that age with the kind of ease that comes from a life genuinely and fully inhabited. She was a mother of 3, and her children were her axis, the point around which everything else in her world revolved. She had a family event to get to at 11 that morning. She had friends who described her warmth with the effortless certainty of people recalling something that had never needed explaining. She lived on Eureka Street in Ballarat East with her husband Mick, in a home that had become a kind of anchor for the people around her. Ballarat itself is a city of about 115,000 people, roughly 115 kilometers northwest of Melbourne, a place that carries the weight of Australian history in its gold rush architecture and its wide, flat streets, but that also hums with ordinary life in the way of all regional cities, full of people who know each other and look out for each other and assume, reasonably and usually correctly, that the world beyond the front gate is safe. On the morning of February 4th, Samantha Murphy stepped out of that home at approximately 7 o'clock. A security camera mounted on her own property captured her in the driveway, the last confirmed image of her alive. She was dressed for a run, black leggings, a singlet top, her running shoes laced and ready. She carried her mobile phone and wore an Apple Watch on her wrist, its GPS quietly noting the beginning of her route. She headed south toward the park, and for a while, the data followed her. Her GPS track showed her moving through the trails of Woo-Woo-Kurrung Regional Park, covering 7 kilometers at a steady pace, making her way through the wooded pathways of Mount Clear, a specific area about 7 kilometers from her home, where the bush thickens and the distance from the residential streets of Ballarat becomes more noticeable with each step. At Mount Clear, the running pattern, which had been regular and rhythmic, became irregular. The data suggested something had interrupted her run. Then it stopped. Samantha Murphy's Apple Watch had an SOS function, a feature that could summon emergency services with the press of a button. It was never activated. Her phone signaled a cell tower in Buniniong, approximately 14 kilometers from her home, but a single tower ping cannot place someone with precision. After that, nothing. No more signals. No more movement. No more Samantha. By midday, when she had not arrived at the family event she had been looking forward to and was not answering her phone, her family knew that something was badly wrong. Mick Murphy called police. The search that followed was one of the largest and most emotionally consuming that the region of Ballarat had ever seen. In the days immediately after Samantha's disappearance, hundreds of volunteers joined police in searching the bushland around Woo-Woo-Kurrung Regional Park and the surrounding areas of Canadian Forest, Mount Helen, and Mount Clear. They moved through dry scrub and along fire tracks, calling her name, scanning the undergrowth with the particular kind of hope that sits just beside terror and is almost indistinguishable from it. Helicopters tracked the landscape from above. Cadaver dogs worked the ground below. Community members who had never met Samantha Murphy came out in their running gear, boots, and high-visibility vests to spend their weekends walking through the bush, because the thought of a woman out there somewhere, alone and unaccounted for, was something that no one in Ballarat could find a way to simply sit with. 5 days after her disappearance, her daughter Jess stood before cameras and microphones and said the words that no child should ever have to say publicly about a parent. "We need you at home with us." She said it plainly and directly, looking into the cameras with red-rimmed eyes, and the simplicity of the appeal, so completely human, so stripped of any artifice, was more devastating than any formal statement could have been. Jess was not speaking to the media. She was speaking to her mother. The week stretched into 2 weeks, and then into 3. Police searched and found nothing. On February 13th, 9 days after Samantha had vanished, the Victoria Police Commissioner Shane Patton spoke publicly about the case and used a word that had until then hovered unspoken over the investigation. He called her disappearance suspicious. There was no trace of her, no evidence of an accident, no sign of a fall, no indication that she had simply lost her way or become injured in the park. A woman who ran regularly in this area, who knew the trails, who had her phone and her smartwatch and planned to be home for 11 o'clock, and nothing. No trace whatsoever. The commissioner said that investigators were considering all possibilities, but that the total absence of any evidence was itself unusual in a way that could not be ignored. In the background, almost invisible to the public in those early weeks, the detectives from Victoria Police Homicide Squad were building something painstaking and immense. They were pulling CCTV footage, not just from cameras in the park area, but from residential streets, industrial premises, service stations, hotels, and private homes throughout the East Ballarat corridor. They were collecting footage from businesses on Ellsworth Street, Joseph Street, and Butt Street, roads that sat between Samantha's home and the bush that Woowookurung connected to, roads that funneled traffic toward the park entrance. They were asking for footage from hotels and pubs in central Ballarat, tracking backward through the Saturday night before Samantha disappeared, piecing together who had been where and when. The evidence brief they were building would eventually be described, when it finally reached a courtroom, as unprecedented in its size. More CCTV footage than any Victorian court had previously been asked to process in a single case. What the cameras were showing, gradually and then unmistakably, was a thread that led to a house in Scotsbin, a small rural community about 15 kilometers south of Ballarat. Patrick Oren Stevenson was 22 years old. He was the son of Oren Stevenson, a former Australian Football League player, and had grown up in the regional Victorian world of small towns and open land that surrounds Ballarat. On the Saturday night before Samantha Murphy disappeared, he had been out socializing in central Ballarat, visiting hotels in the area, and spending the evening with friends in the way that young men in their early 20s do. By all surface accounts, he was an ordinary young man living an ordinary life in an ordinary regional town. He was not known to Samantha Murphy's family. The police were certain of this. He and Samantha had no established connection, no prior relationship, no shared history that anyone could identify. He was, in the language that investigators used carefully and precisely, a stranger. And yet the CCTV footage, the GPS data, the cell tower information, and the broader mosaic of evidence that Victoria Police Homicide Squad had assembled over the course of a month pointed to him with a force that investigators could not and did not set aside. On March 6, 2024, 31 days after Samantha Murphy had stepped out of her front door in her running shoes, detectives arrived at Patrick Stevenson's house in Scotsbin and arrested him. He was taken into custody. The following day, March 7th, he was charged with murder. Victoria Police Chief Commissioner Shane Patton stood before cameras and confirmed what the charge meant. Police believed that Patrick Stevenson had deliberately attacked Samantha Murphy on February 4th, 2024, in the bushland area of Mount Clear, near where her GPS data showed that anomaly in her running track. The commissioner confirmed that Stevenson had not told police where Samantha's body was. He confirmed that police did not believe the two had known each other. In Ballarat, the announcement was received with a kind of grief that had no straightforward name. People had hoped, in the way that communities hope against logic, that there might be another explanation. That Samantha might be found alive. That the absence of her body meant something other than what everyone feared. The charge of murder closed that door. It closed it without opening the new one that Samantha's family needed most, because her body still had not been found. In the days and weeks that followed the arrest, police launched additional targeted searches based on intelligence gathered from the investigation. They searched bushland south of Ballarat near Buniniong, where her phone had last pinged a tower, and found nothing. They searched again in September 2024, bringing in fresh resources and renewed determination. In November 2025, nearly 2 full years after she had vanished, police were still searching a state park near Ballarat, with investigators saying publicly that they wanted to give the Murphy family closure. And still, as months turned into years, Samantha Murphy's remains were not found, though some of her belongings were eventually discovered approximately 20 kilometers south of Ballarat. The belongings confirmed what the GPS had already suggested. She had made it to the park. She had been out there in the bush on a clear summer morning, doing what she loved. And something had ended her run. The legal process ground forward with the particular, careful slowness that serious criminal cases demand. In August 2024, Stevenson appeared in Ballarat Magistrates Court, and his lawyers, alongside prosecutors, requested a 12-week adjournment simply to work through the evidence. The CCTV footage alone was vast, hours and hours of material gathered from dozens of sources across East Ballarat. In January 2025, Stevenson appeared in court again and pleaded guilty to a separate set of charges: drug driving, drink driving, and careless driving offenses from an unrelated incident. He was fined $2,500 and his driver's license was canceled for nearly 2.5 years. It was a minor matter in the scheme of things, but it placed him before a judge once more, a man maintaining his not guilty plea in the murder case while the evidence brief against him continued to be reviewed. In November 2024, standing before a magistrate via video link, Stevenson entered his formal plea in the murder case. "Not guilty, Your Honor," he said. He was committed to stand trial in the Supreme Court of Victoria. The trial was scheduled to begin on April 8, 2026. Throughout all of this, Samantha Murphy's family carried their grief in public and in private. They gave statements where they could. They sat through court appearances and legal processes that moved at a pace entirely disconnected from the urgency that the absence of their mother and wife created in their daily lives. Mick Murphy, Samantha's husband, had watched his wife step out the door on an ordinary February morning and never come back. Their 3 children had grown through the months and seasons of the investigation in the shadow of something that could not be resolved, could not be buried, could not be fully grieved while she remained missing. The family had been denied even the most basic thing that those who lose someone to violence are owed: the chance to bring her home and lay her to rest. The community around them did not stand still. Ballarat was already a community in pain when Samantha disappeared. Just 12 months before, in February 2023, a Ballarat woman named Sissy Austin had been violently attacked while out on a solo run in the same general area of bushland near Mount Clear. Austin survived, and her survival had been its own kind of miracle. But when Samantha Murphy went missing from the same trails, doing the same thing, in the same month of the following year, the parallel was impossible to miss. The same bushland, the same activity, another woman alone on a running track who had done nothing wrong. Austin channeled her experience and her grief into action. She co-founded a movement called Take Back the Track, which campaigned for the safety of women and gender-diverse runners in public spaces, not just in Ballarat, but across Australia. The movement's inaugural National Day was held in February 2025, the first anniversary of Samantha's disappearance, and women and gender-diverse runners across the country joined together to run in solidarity, to reclaim the tracks and paths and parks that belong to everyone, and to say plainly and loudly what should never have needed saying: that a woman has the right to go for a run and come home. The movement drew the backing of marathon champions, Olympic athletes, community leaders, and thousands of ordinary Australians who laced up their running shoes on a Sunday morning and thought of Samantha Murphy. Samantha Murphy had a right to go for a run and return home. The Take Back the Track group said in a statement, "Samantha not returning home to her family and community is a national disgrace." It was also, by the spring of 2026, a case that had compelled Australians to ask questions that went beyond the details of a single investigation. In the 2 months after Samantha disappeared, Ballarat experienced a series of other violent deaths of women, a cluster so statistically devastating that journalists wrote about it in terms usually reserved for systemic crises. Samantha Murphy's disappearance had torn open a conversation about women's safety in public spaces, about the particular vulnerability of women who run alone, and about the responsibility of communities to ensure that a morning jog does not become a risk calculation. The trial of Patrick Oren Stevenson began at the Supreme Court of Victoria in Melbourne on April 8, 2026. He was 24 years old by then. He had spent over 2 years in custody since his arrest, maintaining his not guilty plea, while the prosecution assembled its case from the unprecedented archive of CCTV footage, digital data, forensic evidence, and investigative work that Victoria Police Homicide Squad had built across 2 years. The evidence brief, so vast that it had caused delays simply to allow the defense lawyers time to review it, told a story of movements and timestamps and cameras and signals that the prosecution believed added up to a single, irrefutable conclusion. Outside the courtroom, people were watching, not just in Ballarat, not just in Victoria, but across Australia. Women who had changed their running routes, who now ran in pairs, who had downloaded safety apps or started carrying their phones differently. They were watching because the case of Samantha Murphy had become something larger than itself. A reckoning about who gets to feel safe in a public park on a clear morning, and what happens when the answer is not everyone. Samantha Murphy was a mother of 3 who trained for marathon distances and rose before sunrise to get her kilometers in before the day demanded other things of her. She was a woman who talked about her running plans at Sunday dinner and told her family she would be home by 11. She was someone who inspired a national movement simply by being the person she was, doing the things she loved, and not coming home. She was 51 years old, and she had, by every account of every person who knew her, an enormous amount of living still ahead of her. Her family is still waiting to bring her home. Her body has not been found. The search has never fully stopped. And somewhere in the system of justice that turns slowly and carefully, and with the weight of consequence, a court is working toward an answer for a family, and for a country that has been waiting far too long for one. Story 3. The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow over Evansville, Indiana, on October 19, 2021, as Timothy Scott Ivey prepared for what he thought would be an exciting evening. At 50 years old, Tim had found something he had not expected at this stage of his life: a meaningful relationship with a woman named Amanda Sieb. They had been dating for just over a year, and their connection had grown into something comfortable and genuine. Tim was a devoted father to his adult daughter and son, a man known to his family for his loving nature and steady presence in their lives. He could not have known, as he and Amanda made plans for that October evening, that he had less than 12 hours left to live. Amanda Sieb had been exploring a dating application, looking to meet new people and perhaps expand the social circle she shared with Tim. In the digital age, such apps had become commonplace, offering seemingly endless possibilities for connection. Through one of these platforms, Amanda had matched with a woman who called herself Heidi Carter. The two women had exchanged messages, building a rapport that seemed friendly and genuine. Heidi mentioned that she had a boyfriend named Kerry Hammond, and she suggested that perhaps the 4 of them could meet up together, maybe explore the possibilities that came with couples connecting in unconventional ways. It seemed harmless enough, maybe even exciting. What Amanda did not know, what she could not have known from the carefully curated profile and messages, was that nearly everything Heidi Carter had told her was a lie. The woman behind the screen had constructed an elaborate fiction, presenting a version of herself that bore little resemblance to reality. Behind the friendly messages and casual suggestions lay something far darker than Amanda could have imagined. But on that October afternoon, believing she was simply meeting a new friend, Amanda extended an invitation to Tim. Would he be interested in meeting this couple she had connected with online? Tim, trusting Amanda's judgment and curious about the evening ahead, agreed. Heidi Carter lived in a house on Stinson Avenue on Evansville's west side. It was an unremarkable residence in a working-class neighborhood, the kind of place where neighbors might wave in passing, but largely kept to their own concerns. Inside that house, Heidi Carter lived with Carrie David Hammond, her boyfriend, and the dynamic between them was complicated in ways that outsiders could not easily perceive. Heidi had a history that included violence, a criminal record that painted a picture of someone capable of unpredictable and dangerous behavior. But Amanda and Tim knew none of this as they drove to Stinson Avenue that evening, believing they were simply meeting new friends. When Amanda and Tim arrived at the house, they were welcomed inside by Heidi and Carrie. The initial interactions likely seemed normal enough, the awkward pleasantries that come with meeting strangers for the first time. But somewhere in those first minutes or hours, the evening took a turn that would transform what was supposed to be a social gathering into a nightmare. According to the testimony that Amanda would later provide to law enforcement and in court, she and Tim found themselves engaged in consensual, intimate activity with the couple in Heidi's bedroom. It was the kind of situation that, however unconventional, should have remained a private matter between adults. But Carrie Hammond had a pattern of behavior that would prove catastrophic. He had a habit of arriving at Heidi's home at a particular time, and on this evening, he walked into the bedroom at his usual hour. What he witnessed when he entered that room triggered a violent rage that would escalate beyond anything that could have been anticipated. Hammond saw Tim with Heidi, and something inside him snapped. He grabbed a baseball bat and began striking Tim with brutal force. The blows rained down on Tim, who was caught completely off guard, unable to defend himself effectively against the sudden assault. Amanda watched in horror as the man she cared about was beaten. The evening had descended into chaos and violence in a matter of seconds. But Hammond was not satisfied with simply beating Tim. As the assault continued, Hammond and Heidi began to discuss what to do next. The conversation that followed revealed the true depths of their depravity. Hammond stated clearly that there could not be any witnesses to what had just occurred. Both Amanda and Tim, he declared, would have to die. Heidi, rather than attempting to de-escalate the situation or call for help, agreed with this assessment and even mentioned that she knew people in Indianapolis who could dispose of a body. What followed were hours that Heidi and Hammond bound Tim's wrists and ankles with duct tape, immobilizing him completely. They covered his face with duct tape as well, cutting off his ability to breathe freely or call for help. Then, in an act that demonstrated the calculated cruelty of their actions, they turned the torture of Tim into what they called a game, taking turns kicking him as he lay bound and helpless on the floor. Tim tried to cry out, tried to grab at Hammond when he came close, but his resistance only led to further violence. At some point during this prolonged torture, Hammond grabbed a bungee cord or a piece of red cloth that had been placed around Tim's neck and used it to strangle him. Amanda, who did not have her glasses and could not see well, heard the sounds of struggle and knew that Tim was dying. She was powerless to stop it, herself a captive in this house of horrors, terrified that at any moment Hammond would turn his full attention to her and fulfill his promise that she too must die. But Hammond had other plans for Amanda before she died. While Tim lay dying or already dead nearby, Hammond repeatedly assaulted Amanda. The attacks went on for hours, with Heidi not only failing to intervene, but actively participating in the confinement and control of the victim. Amanda was held captive in that house, subjected to violation after violation, all while knowing that the man she loved was dead just feet away. The psychological torture of this situation, layered on top of the physical assaults, created trauma that would affect Amanda for the rest of her life. At some point during the night, another person arrived at the house on Stinson Avenue. A woman named Cynthia Winesapfel had been hired to clean Heidi's home. She arrived expecting to perform routine housekeeping work, unaware that she was walking into the aftermath of a murder and an ongoing kidnapping. Heidi instructed Winesapfel to clean the front of the house while she and Hammond remained in the back bedroom. Winesapfel noticed things that seemed off, details that did not quite add up, but she could not have imagined the full scope of what was happening behind the closed door at the back of the house. While Winesapfel worked in the front rooms, Heidi and Hammond went about the grim business of dealing with Tim's body. They wrapped his corpse in blankets and dragged it from the bedroom into the dining room. At one point, Heidi left the house to purchase cigarettes and food, maintaining a facade of normalcy, even as a dead body lay wrapped in blankets in her dining room and a woman remained imprisoned in her bedroom. For Amanda, the hours stretched into an eternity. She had no way of knowing if anyone would come to help her, if anyone even knew she was missing. She was alone with people who had already murdered once and had explicitly stated their intention to kill her as well. Every sound, every movement could have been the moment when they decided to finish what they had started. But outside the house on Stinson Avenue, people had begun to notice that something was wrong. Law enforcement received information that led them to the residence on October 19th. When Evansville Police Department officers arrived at the scene, they approached with caution, knowing they were potentially dealing with a dangerous situation. As officers positioned themselves around the property, Kerry Hammond emerged from the house. In his hands, he clutched an object that appeared to officers to be a firearm. In the tense seconds that followed, with officers commanding Hammond to drop the weapon and surrender, Hammond failed to comply. The officers, believing they were facing an armed and dangerous suspect, opened fire. Hammond was shot and killed. When officers entered the house after the shooting, they found Amanda Sieb. She was immediately transported to a hospital for medical treatment and evaluation. The officers also found what Heidi and Hammond had been trying to conceal. In the area of the house near where they had referenced the Christmas tree, investigators discovered Tim's body. The initial examination of the scene made clear that whatever had happened to Tim, it had been brutal and prolonged. The subsequent autopsy performed by forensic pathologist Dr. James Jacoby revealed the full extent of the violence inflicted upon Timothy Ivy. Dr. Jacoby determined that Tim had suffered multiple forms of trauma. There was evidence of manual strangulation, with bruises on his neck consistent with someone choking him with their hands. There was also evidence of ligature strangulation, with crease marks on his neck indicating that something had been tightened around his throat. Finally, there was evidence of suffocation, as Tim's face had been completely encased in duct tape. Dr. Jacoby could not definitively determine which of these three mechanisms had ultimately caused Tim's death, but it was clear that any one of them could have been fatal. Tim had died from a combination of being beaten, strangled, and suffocated while bound and helpless. The investigation also revealed the twisted nature of what Hammond had been holding when police shot him. It was not actually a gun, but rather a selfie stick that had been twisted and shaped to resemble a firearm. Investigators concluded that Hammond, knowing he would face murder charges and likely spend the rest of his life in prison, had intentionally created the appearance of being armed to provoke police into shooting him. It was what law enforcement officials call suicide by cop, a final act of violence turned inward after a night of directing violence at others. Heidi Carter was arrested and taken to the Evansville Police Department for questioning. During a 2-hour interview with detectives, Carter initially denied participating in the crimes perpetrated against Amanda and Tim. She attempted to distance herself from the violence, suggesting that Hammond had acted alone and that she had been powerless to stop him. She told detectives that Hammond had said from the beginning there could not be any witnesses and that both Amanda and Tim had to die. When asked why she had not called 911 when she left the house to buy cigarettes and food, Carter claimed she had been afraid Hammond would kill everyone. But as investigators gathered evidence, including digital communications and forensic evidence from the house, a different picture emerged. This was not a case of an innocent bystander caught up in her boyfriend's violence. Heidi Carter had been an active participant in the torture, murder, and physical assault that occurred in her home. She had helped bind Tim with duct tape. She had participated in the kicking that they had turned into a game. She had been present during the sexual assaults on Amanda and had done nothing to stop them or help the victim escape. Her claims of being a victim herself rang hollow against the weight of the evidence. Heidi Kathleen Carter was charged with multiple serious offenses: aiding, inducing, or causing murder, a level 1 felony; 2 counts of aiding, inducing, or causing rape, also level 1 felonies; and 3 counts of criminal confinement, level 3 felonies. The state of Indiana moved forward with prosecuting Carter, determined to hold her accountable for her role in the horrific events of October 19, 2021. The first trial began on November 28, 2022, in Vanderburg Circuit Court. Over 3 days, the jury heard testimony about the events of that night, including Amanda Sieb's heartbreaking account of what she had endured. The jury also heard about the evidence found at the scene and the autopsy findings regarding Tim's death. But when deliberations concluded, the jury returned a mixed verdict. They convicted Carter on a Class A misdemeanor charge of carrying a handgun without a license, but were unable to reach unanimous verdicts on the more serious charges. The trial ended without resolution on the murder, rape, and confinement charges. The prosecution, unwilling to let the case end in such an unsatisfying manner, pursued a second trial. This time, they would present additional evidence and testimony to ensure the jury understood the full scope of Carter's involvement. The second trial took place over 3 days in February 2023. Once again, Amanda Sieb took the stand and recounted the nightmare she had lived through. Tim's family members also testified, describing the man they had loved and lost and the devastating impact his murder had had on their lives. On February 15, 2023, after hearing all the evidence, the jury returned with their verdict. This time, they found Heidi Kathleen Carter guilty on all 6 counts. She was convicted of aiding, inducing, or causing murder, 2 counts of aiding, inducing, or causing rape, and 3 counts of criminal confinement. The courtroom was filled with Tim's family members and supporters, who had waited more than a year for justice. The guilty verdict was a moment of relief, though it could never undo the horror of what had happened. On March 16, 2023, almost exactly 1 month after her conviction, Heidi Carter appeared before Vanderburg County Circuit Court Judge David Keeley for sentencing. The hearing was emotional and charged with tension. Tim's family members addressed the court, asking for a lengthy sentence that would reflect the gravity of Carter's crimes. Tim's ex-wife, Jamie Combs, spoke about how Tim had been a loving father to their children, and how the trauma of losing him had taken an immense toll on the entire family. Their daughter, who was 24 years old, submitted a letter describing the ongoing pain of losing the one person in the world she had been closest to. Amanda Sieb also testified at the sentencing hearing. She told the court that her life had been completely destroyed by what happened on October 19, 2021. She explained that she did not have anything close to any kind of normal life anymore, that the physical and psychological scars from that night would be with her forever. Her courage in speaking publicly about what she had endured was remarkable, given the intimate and traumatic nature of the assaults she had suffered. For her part, Heidi Carter addressed the court with a statement that seemed to indicate she still did not fully grasp or accept responsibility for what she had done. She said, "Yes, I was living in sin, but did I commit any crimes? No. Under the circumstances, I did the best that I could. I'm a victim too." It was a statement that seemed to ignore the mountain of evidence that had led to her conviction and the testimony of the woman who had actually been victimized. Judge David Keeley was unmoved by Carter's claims of innocence. Before announcing the sentence, he noted the defendant's lack of concern that a human life had been lost. He pointed to the sadistic nature of the crimes and the deliberate choices Carter had made throughout that terrible night. The prosecutor who had tried the case, Stan Levko, had told the press that the murder and rape were among the most sadistic, if not the most sadistic, he had ever prosecuted in his career. Judge Keeley sentenced Heidi Kathleen Carter to 65 years in a state prison. The sentence consisted of time for the murder charge, time for the rape charges, and time for the confinement charges. She would also receive credit for 505 days she had already served in the county jail while awaiting trial. Carter indicated she would appeal her conviction, and the court appointed an appellate attorney at taxpayer expense due to her lack of funds. But for Tim's family and for Amanda, the sentencing represented a measure of closure, a recognition by the justice system that what had been done to Tim and Amanda was unconscionable and deserved severe punishment. Timothy Scott Ivy had been born on May 18, 1971, in Evansville, Indiana. For 50 years, he had lived a life that touched the people around him with love and kindness. He had raised children who adored him and had found love again with Amanda. On October 19, 2021, his life was taken from him in a senseless act of violence perpetrated by people he had just met, people who transformed a social encounter into a torture chamber. He died bound and helpless, unable to defend himself or escape, his final hours filled with pain and terror. For Amanda Sieb, survival came at an unimaginable cost. She would carry the physical and psychological scars of that night for the rest of her life. But she had also demonstrated remarkable courage in testifying against Carter and ensuring that justice was served. Her decision to speak publicly about what had happened to her and to allow her name to be used in news reports was an act of bravery, a refusal to let shame silence her story. The case sent shockwaves through Evansville and beyond. It served as a grim reminder of the potential dangers lurking behind online connections and the importance of caution when meeting strangers. It also highlighted the capacity for human cruelty, the way that violence can erupt without warning and consume innocent people who happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And it demonstrated the resilience of survivors like Amanda and the families like Tim's, who must find a way to continue living after experiencing profound loss and trauma. Heidi Carter remains incarcerated in an Indiana state prison, serving her 65-year sentence. Tim Ivy's family continues to mourn his loss, finding what comfort they can in the knowledge that his killer was held accountable. And Amanda Sieb works each day to rebuild a life that was shattered on an October night when she walked through a door expecting to meet new friends and instead encountered evil. Story 4. The morning of January 17, 2020, dawned cold and gray over Grantsville, Utah, a small town of roughly 11,000 souls nestled in the Tooele Valley, some 35 miles west of Salt Lake City. It was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other's names, where children rode bicycles down quiet streets, and where violence was a distant concept that happened elsewhere, to other people in other towns. In fact, Grantsville had not seen a homicide in nearly 2 decades, a statistic that residents wore like a badge of honor. On this particular Friday, as the winter sun struggled to break through the overcast sky, no one could have imagined that the peace they had known for so long was about to be shattered in the most unthinkable way. For the Haney family, Friday began like any other school day. Consuelo Alejandra Haney, a 52-year-old mother of 5, prepared to navigate the rhythms of her household. Her husband, Colin, would head to work, and their children would scatter to their various schools and activities. Their oldest son, Danny, was away at Utah Valley University, building his future and living the life of a college student. At home, the couple still had 4 children to care for: 15-year-old Alexis, 14-year-old Matthew, and 12-year-old Milan, the youngest, who brought brightness to her mother's days. And then there was their middle child, 16-year-old Colin Jeffrey Haney, known to everyone as CJ. On the surface, CJ seemed like any other teenager navigating the turbulent waters of adolescence. But beneath that surface, darker currents swirled. In the weeks leading up to that Friday, his family had begun to notice troubling signs. There were arguments with his father, increasingly frequent and heated. There was a growing sense of isolation, as CJ pulled away from the world around him, retreating into himself. His older brother Danny would later recall that the family had seen what he described as red flags about a month before the tragedy, indicators that CJ was wrestling with dark thoughts that frightened them all. Consuelo, with a mother's intuition and concern, had asked her son if he wanted to speak with a therapist, to have someone help him navigate whatever storm was building inside him. But his father, Colin, had refused to pursue that path, worried about what CJ might say in therapy, fearful that such admissions might lead to consequences the family wasn't prepared to face. That Friday morning, CJ made a decision. Instead of going to school, he stayed home. As his family members left the house one by one, heading off to work and school, he remained behind in the quiet of the empty house. What thoughts occupied his mind during those morning hours, no one can say with certainty. But at some point, he retrieved a handgun. He made preparations, and he waited. At approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Consuelo Haney returned home with her youngest daughter, Milan, whom she had just picked up from school. It was a routine they had performed countless times before, mother and daughter arriving home together, perhaps discussing the events of Milan's school day, perhaps planning what to do with the rest of the afternoon. As they walked through the door of their house on Harvest Lane, they had no warning of what awaited them inside. CJ was there, waiting with the handgun. In a matter of moments, everything changed. He shot his mother and his 12-year-old sister multiple times, firing bullets into their heads, necks, and upper bodies. The violence was swift and brutal, shattering the quiet of the afternoon with sounds that would never be forgotten. Consuelo Alejandra Haney, who had worried about her son's mental state and had tried to get him help, died in her own home. Little Milan, just 12 years old, with her whole life stretching out before her, died alongside her mother. And then CJ waited again. The house fell silent except for whatever sounds he made as he moved through the rooms, as he prepared for what came next. The clock ticked forward, minutes turning into an hour, then more. Outside, life in Grantsville continued its peaceful rhythm, unaware of the horror unfolding behind the walls of the Haney home. Between 2 and 5:17 in the afternoon, 15-year-old Alexis Haney came home. Perhaps she called out for her mother when she walked through the door. Perhaps she sensed immediately that something was wrong. Whatever her last moments held, they ended when her brother opened fire. CJ shot Alexis multiple times, 5 bullets striking her in the head and chest. The teenager fell, becoming the third victim in a massacre that was still not complete. The hours continued their cruel march forward. CJ remained in the house with the bodies of his mother and 2 sisters, waiting for the next family member to arrive. The isolation he had been feeling, the arguments with his father, the unfulfilled expectations that had been building inside him, all of this had somehow culminated in this methodical, calculated violence. Later, investigators would struggle to understand his motive, to make sense of how a teenager could arrive at the conclusion that murdering his family was the only solution to his problems. But on that Friday afternoon, motive mattered less than the terrible reality of what was happening. At approximately 5:17 in the evening, 14-year-old Matthew Haney arrived home. As his brother had done with the others, CJ was waiting. But with Matthew, the execution was different, if no less horrifying. CJ fired a single bullet into his younger brother's head, killing him instantly in what prosecutors would later describe as an execution-style murder. For members of the Haney family now lay dead in their home, and the sun was beginning to set over Grantsville. Around 6:15 in the evening, Colin Haney, the patriarch of the family, returned home from work. He had no idea that he was walking into a nightmare, that his wife and 3 of his children were already dead, that his son was waiting for him with a gun. When Colin walked through the door, CJ opened fire once more, but this time something changed. The bullet struck Colin in the leg, causing immediate pain and injury, but it did not incapacitate him. In that moment, survival instinct and perhaps a father's fierce love for his remaining son kicked in. Despite the shock, despite the pain radiating from his wounded leg, Colin Haney did not freeze. He did not surrender. Instead, he fought back. What followed was a desperate struggle between father and son, a physical confrontation that would determine whether the violence would claim yet another victim. Colin, even wounded and likely in tremendous pain, managed to close the distance between himself and his son. He grappled with CJ, fighting for control of the weapon that had already taken so much from him. His hands found the gun, and with a strength born of desperation, and perhaps the understanding that his life hung in the balance, he wrenched it from his son's grasp. As Colin stood there, bleeding from his leg wound, holding the gun he had just wrestled away, his son delivered words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. CJ told his father that his mother and siblings were dead, that he had killed them. More chillingly, he revealed his intention. He had planned to kill everyone in the house except himself. The violence had been deliberate, methodical, a plan executed over the course of 5 hours as each family member returned home, unaware of the death that awaited them. A neighbor, responding to the crisis, helped transport both Colin and CJ to the hospital. During that ride, or shortly after arrival, CJ confessed to what he had done. When police arrived at the Haney home to investigate, they discovered the full scope of the tragedy. For people dead, a family destroyed, and a community forever changed. News of the murders spread through Grantsville like a shockwave. For a town that had gone nearly 20 years without a homicide, the reality of what had happened was almost impossible to process. This was not just a murder, it was a familicide, a mass shooting. The community rallied around the surviving family members, particularly Colin Haney, who had lost his wife and 3 children in one terrible afternoon. Yellow ribbons began appearing throughout the neighborhood and town, tied to trees and posts and fences, silent symbols of grief and solidarity. Signs were posted, expressing condolences and support. 2 online fundraisers were quickly established, one through GoFundMe and another through a local market, to help with medical costs for Colin's injuries and funeral expenses, a testament to the community's desire to help in whatever way they could. Utah Governor Gary Herbert issued a statement expressing his condolences to the family and the community. He also used the tragedy as an opportunity to remind adults with guns in their homes about the critical importance of proper firearm security. It was a message that resonated in the wake of a shooting where a teenager had gained access to a handgun and used it to commit mass murder. For Colin Haney, the physical wounds would eventually heal, but the emotional and psychological scars would last a lifetime. He had survived, but at what cost? His wife, the mother of his children, was gone. 3 of his 5 children were dead, and his surviving son, CJ, was the one who had taken them away. During the subsequent legal proceedings, Colin attended court hearings, but often chose not to make statements, his grief too heavy for public expression. Danny Haney, the oldest son who had been at college during the shooting, and thus escaped the violence, found himself in the agonizing position of being one of only 2 surviving members of his immediate family. During CJ's sentencing hearing, Danny addressed the court via audio call, speaking about the red flags the family had noticed and the missed opportunity to get his brother mental health treatment. The weight of what-if questions would follow the survivors. What if they had insisted on therapy? What if they had recognized the danger sooner? What if? Colin Jeffrey Haney was arrested at the hospital and charged as an adult in the 3rd District Court with 4 counts of aggravated murder, 1 count of attempted aggravated murder, and 5 counts of illegal discharge of a firearm. During his initial court appearance, bail was set at $4 million, and he was ordered to remain in a juvenile detention facility. A public defender was appointed to represent him. For more than 2 years, the case wound its way through the legal system, delayed in part by the COVID-19 pandemic and in part by ongoing negotiations between attorneys. Throughout this period, CJ largely refused to communicate with law enforcement about his motives, leaving investigators and the public to piece together an understanding of why this tragedy had occurred. What emerged was a picture of a troubled teenager struggling with increasing social isolation, engaged in frequent arguments with his father, and grappling with unfulfilled expectations. According to court documents, he had come to believe that shooting his family was the only solution for himself. It was a conclusion so warped, so divorced from reality, that it defied comprehension. Because CJ was a juvenile at the time of the murders, certain sentencing options were not available. He could not be sentenced to death or to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. He faced a minimum sentence of 25 years and a maximum of life in prison with the possibility of parole. On July 19, 2022, more than 2 years after the murders, C.J. Haney entered a guilty plea to the charges against him. The 5 additional charges related to the discharge of a firearm were dismissed as part of a plea agreement. By pleading guilty, he acknowledged his responsibility for the deaths of his mother, Consuelo Alejandra Haney, and his siblings Alexis, Matthew, and Milan, as well as for the attempted murder of his father. The sentencing hearing took place on July 12, 2023. By this time, CJ was 19 years old, no longer the 16-year-old who had committed the murders, but still bearing responsibility for them. The court sentenced him to 4 consecutive terms of 25 years to life for each murder, plus a concurrent term of 25 years to life for the attempted murder of his father. The consecutive nature of the sentences meant that CJ would serve at least 100 years in prison, effectively ensuring he would spend the rest of his life incarcerated. He was also ordered to pay $28,000 in restitution. During the sentencing hearing, his father, Colin, was present at the hearing but chose not to make a statement. The decision about whether CJ would remain at the youth detention center where he was being held, or be transferred to an adult facility, was left to the Board of Pardons. The case of Colin Jeffrey Haney and the murders of his family members on January 17, 2020, leaves us with profound questions about warning signs, mental health, family dynamics, and the capacity for violence that can lurk behind the most ordinary facades. How does a teenager come to the conclusion that murdering his entire family is a solution to anything? What internal landscape of pain, anger, and distorted thinking leads someone to that precipice? The red flags that Danny Haney mentioned, the ones the family noticed about a month before the tragedy, serve as a haunting reminder of how difficult it can be to know when concern should escalate into urgent action. Consuelo Haney had asked her son if he wanted therapy, demonstrating that she recognized something was wrong. But Colin Haney's reluctance to pursue that option, stemming from fear of legal consequences, meant that CJ never received professional mental health intervention. Would therapy have prevented the murders? No one can say with certainty, but the question lingers. The methodical nature of the killings, waiting hours between murders, executing his plan as each family member arrived home, speaks to a level of calculation and resolve that is particularly chilling. This was not an impulsive act committed in a moment of rage. It was premeditated, planned, and carried out with cold determination over the course of 5 hours. For the community of Grantsville, the murders shattered the sense of safety that had prevailed for nearly 2 decades. The yellow ribbons that adorned the town served as visible reminders that violence can strike anywhere, even in the quietest and most peaceful of places. And for the broader public, the case serves as yet another reminder of the importance of taking mental health seriously, of recognizing warning signs, and of acting on concerns even when doing so feels uncomfortable or frightening. The house on Harvest Lane, where 4 people died on a cold January day, stands as a monument to loss, to the fragility of family bonds, and to the devastating consequences when darkness goes unaddressed. Colin and Danny Haney continue to live with their loss, carrying the weight of that Friday afternoon for the rest of their lives. And somewhere in a detention facility, Colin Jeffrey Haney serves a sentence that will likely never end, having destroyed his family and his own future in 5 hours of unfathomable violence. Story 5. In the spring of 2020, as the world grappled with the COVID-19 pandemic and Britain entered its first lockdown, 28-year-old Phoenix Nets was living in a multi-occupancy house on Salisbury Road in Birmingham. The house served as temporary accommodation, a place where people in transition found shelter while working to rebuild their lives. Phoenix had been staying there for some time, sharing the space with other residents who were navigating their own challenges. Among her housemates was a 27-year-old woman named Garika Gordon, someone Phoenix had come to know through their shared living situation. The two women had developed what appeared to be a friendship, the kind of connection that can form between people thrown together by circumstance in communal housing. Phoenix had roots in London, where her family lived, and she had been talking about her plans to move back to be closer to them. After months in Birmingham, she was ready to return home, to reconnect with her family and start fresh. For someone living in temporary housing far from loved ones, the prospect of going home must have felt like a beacon of hope. Phoenix shared these plans with people around her in the days leading up to mid-April, expressing her intention to leave Birmingham soon. But Phoenix Nets would never make it back to London. She would never see her family again. Instead, her life would end in that Birmingham house, and her story would become one of the most disturbing murder cases Britain had seen in years. April 16, 2020, was the day Phoenix's life ended, though no one outside that house on Salisbury Road knew it at the time. Britain was deep in lockdown, streets were quiet, and people were confined to their homes except for essential activities. Inside the Salisbury Road house, Garika Gordon attacked Phoenix Nets with a knife. The attack was brutal and sustained. Phoenix was stabbed 4 times in the torso, the blade piercing her body and causing injuries that, while not immediately fatal individually, led to her death hours later as she bled internally. The woman Phoenix had known as a housemate, perhaps even as a friend, had turned on her with lethal violence. What happened in the immediate aftermath of Phoenix's death would reveal a level of calculation and callousness that shocked even experienced homicide investigators. Rather than calling for help, rather than reporting what had happened, Garika Gordon made a different choice. She decided to hide what she had done, to conceal Phoenix's murder and dispose of her body in a way that might allow the crime to go undetected. Over the hours and days that followed Phoenix's death, Gordon began implementing a plan that demonstrated both elaborate preparation and chilling determination. The first step was taking control of Phoenix's phone. Gordon knew that if Phoenix suddenly went silent, if she stopped responding to messages and calls, people would become concerned and start asking questions. So Gordon began sending text messages from Phoenix's phone to her friends, pretending to be Phoenix. The messages reassured recipients that Phoenix was fine, that she had decided to move back to London as she had been planning, that everything was normal. To Phoenix's housing officer, Gordon sent similar messages explaining that Phoenix was leaving Birmingham and returning to her family. The deception was designed to create a narrative. Phoenix had simply moved away, nothing suspicious, nothing to investigate. But some people who received these messages sensed something was wrong. The tone wasn't quite right, or the phrasing seemed off, or there were inconsistencies that raised suspicions. When questions began to emerge, when people pushed back asking for more direct contact with Phoenix, Gordon adapted her strategy. She used audio editing software to create distorted voice notes that she sent from Phoenix's phone, attempting to make it sound like Phoenix was actually speaking to them. The voice notes were garbled and unclear, but Gordon hoped they would be sufficient to quiet the growing concerns of people who knew Phoenix. While Gordon was sending these fraudulent messages and voice notes, she was also conducting disturbing internet searches on Phoenix's phone. The search history would later provide chilling insight into Gordon's state of mind in the hours after she killed Phoenix. She searched for, "Can someone recover from getting stabbed?" Perhaps wondering if Phoenix might somehow survive the injuries she had inflicted. She searched for, "Can a body burn to ashes with petrol?" revealing that she was already contemplating how to dispose of Phoenix's remains. These searches demonstrated that Gordon understood the severity of what she had done and was actively seeking information about how to conceal the crime. Gordon ordered items that would prove crucial to her plan. She purchased industrial-strength bleach from an online company, along with other cleaning products and a sleeping bag from Home Bargains. Most disturbingly, she ordered a circular saw. When it arrived, Gordon used that saw to dismember Phoenix's body, cutting it into pieces that could be more easily transported and concealed. The act required a level of detachment from humanity that is difficult to comprehend. Taking someone she had known, someone she had lived alongside, and methodically cutting apart her body, as though it were simply an object to be managed. Gordon arranged for waste disposal companies to collect items from the house that might contain evidence. She had carpet removed, along with a bed frame and Phoenix's personal possessions, eliminating physical traces of what had occurred. She cleaned extensively with the industrial bleach she had ordered, attempting to erase forensic evidence that could connect her to the crime. Every action demonstrated premeditation and planning, a systematic effort to cover her tracks and create the illusion that Phoenix had simply moved away. For the actual disposal of Phoenix's body, Gordon purchased 2 suitcases. She placed Phoenix's dismembered and burned remains inside these cases, dividing the body parts between them. Then she began a series of trips that would eventually lead investigators on a complex trail across central England. Gordon didn't have a car of her own, so she booked a vehicle through Gumtree, a classified advertisements website. She made multiple trips to Colford, a market town in the Forest of Dean in Gloucestershire, more than 70 miles from Birmingham. She also traveled by train on some occasions, carrying the suitcases containing Phoenix's remains through public transportation, past other passengers who had no idea what was inside the luggage. At one point during this period, Gordon took the 2 suitcases to a cemetery in Handsworth, a district of Birmingham. She hid the cases there for several days, perhaps believing the cemetery would provide temporary concealment for the grim cargo. But ultimately, Gordon decided to transport the remains to the Forest of Dean, to a remote area near Stofield Quarry, where she apparently hoped to dispose of them permanently without detection. As April turned to May, nearly a month had passed since Phoenix's death. Gordon had been maintaining her deception throughout this time, continuing to send messages from Phoenix's phone, continuing to tell people that Phoenix was fine and had moved away. The elaborate cover-up had been sustained for weeks, but on the evening of May 12, 2020, Gordon's carefully constructed plan began to unravel. A member of the public noticed something unusual on the A4136 road near Colford in the Forest of Dean. A car was being driven erratically, weaving in a way that suggested either impairment or distress. Concerned about public safety, the witness reported their suspicions to Gloucestershire Constabulary. Police officers responded to the call and began searching the area for the vehicle that had been described. Around 11:30 p.m., officers located the car parked near Stofield Quarry, in the area between Colford and the village of Staunton. They approached and spoke to the occupants. 2 people were in or near the vehicle. As the officers conducted their investigation, they noticed 2 suitcases sitting at the side of the road. The suitcases seemed out of place in this remote location, far from any residence or obvious reason for luggage to be left roadside. The officers attempted to examine the suitcases, but one of the people present, a woman, tried to stop them from opening the cases. Her attempts to prevent the officers from looking inside only heightened their suspicions. The officers insisted on opening the suitcases, and when they did, they made a discovery that would haunt them. Inside the cases were human remains, a body that had been dismembered and burned. The remains had been divided between the 2 suitcases, concealed in a way that suggested someone had gone to great lengths to hide what had happened to this person. The woman who had tried to prevent the officers from opening the suitcases was Garika Gordon. She was immediately arrested on suspicion of murder, along with a man who had been with her. The vehicle they had been using was seized as evidence. What had begun as a report of erratic driving had led to the discovery of one of the most disturbing homicide cases Gloucestershire police had encountered. A major investigation was launched immediately. Road closures were put in place around Stofield Quarry and the surrounding area. The A4136 between Monmouth and Colford was closed to traffic as investigators worked to secure the crime scene and search for any additional evidence. Police helicopters flew over the Forest of Dean, searching the wooded areas and quarry. Officers combed through the village of Staunton and the surrounding forests, looking for anything that might help them understand what had happened. Detective Chief Inspector John Turner, who served as the senior investigating officer, addressed the public about the ongoing investigation. He acknowledged the distressing nature of what had been discovered and emphasized that investigators were working around the clock to understand the full scope of what had occurred. The most immediate priority was identifying the victim whose remains had been found in those suitcases. Someone's life had been taken, and that person's family deserved answers. The investigation created significant disruption in the area. Roads remained closed for days, affecting local residents and key workers who had to find detours during a time when Britain was still in COVID-19 lockdown. Some people initially thought the roadblocks might be related to preventing people from traveling between England and Wales to exercise, as lockdown rules at the time restricted people to exercising only in their local areas. The police presence was massive and sustained, reflecting the seriousness of what had been discovered. Gordon and the man who had been with her were taken into custody for questioning. A magistrate granted custody extensions that allowed police to continue interrogating them while investigators worked to identify the victim and gather evidence. The man, who was in his 30s and from Wolverhampton, was eventually charged with assisting an offender, specifically helping Gordon between April 25th and May 12th, 2020. Gordon, who was 27 years old and from Birmingham, was charged with murder. Both suspects appeared before Cheltenham Magistrates Court on May 19, 2020, via video link. They were refused bail and remanded to appear before Gloucester Crown Court. The man was later granted conditional bail with strict requirements. He had to reside at his home address, follow a curfew between 7 p.m. and 7 a.m., report to police daily, and surrender his travel documents. Gordon made no application for bail and remained in custody. The process of identifying the victim required DNA testing and forensic examination. A post-mortem examination proved inconclusive initially, requiring further tests to establish cause of death. As investigators worked on identification, they also began expanding their search beyond Gloucestershire. On May 15, 2020, police searched properties in both Wolverhampton and Birmingham, following leads that suggested the murder had not occurred in the Forest of Dean but somewhere else. The DNA results eventually provided an answer to the crucial question of the victim's identity. The remains found in the suitcases belonged to Phoenix Nets, a 28-year-old woman from Birmingham. With this identification came the heartbreaking task of notifying Phoenix's family, who learned that the daughter, sister, and loved one they had been expecting to return to London was dead, murdered, dismembered, and nearly disposed of in a remote quarry. As investigators delved deeper into the case, jurisdiction shifted. Detectives from West Midlands Police took over the investigation from Gloucestershire Constabulary after determining that Phoenix had been murdered in Birmingham, not in the Forest of Dean. The house on Salisbury Road became the focus of intensive forensic examination. Investigators conducted a painstaking analysis of the scene, looking for evidence that would explain exactly what had happened to Phoenix. The investigative team undertook a massive CCTV trawl, examining hours of footage to track Garika Gordon's movements in the month before Phoenix's body was discovered. The surveillance footage revealed the trips Gordon had made to Colford, the journeys to the Handsworth Cemetery, the movements of the suitcases. Investigators could see Gordon transporting luggage that they now knew contained Phoenix's remains, traveling through public spaces with a cargo of unimaginable horror. Phone and financial analysis provided additional layers of evidence. Gordon's internet searches on Phoenix's phone, the questions about recovery from stabbing, the queries about burning bodies with petrol, created a damning record of her state of mind after the murder. The messages she had sent pretending to be Phoenix, the audio files she had created using editing software, the purchases of cleaning supplies and a circular saw, all of it painted a picture of elaborate deception and calculated concealment. Initially, Gordon was scheduled to stand trial in November 2020, but the case was delayed. By this time, all charges against the man from Wolverhampton had been dropped, with prosecutors apparently concluding that his involvement had been limited and that he may not have known what was in the suitcases or the full extent of Gordon's crimes. On April 21, 2021, Just days before her trial was scheduled to begin, Garika Gordon appeared via video link from HM Prison Eastwood Park before Bristol Crown Court. Rather than proceeding to trial, she changed her plea. Gordon pleaded guilty to murdering Phoenix Nets. The Crown Prosecution Service confirmed that the murder had occurred on April 16, 2020, the same day Phoenix had been stabbed 4 times and left to die over several hours from her injuries. The guilty plea meant Phoenix's family would be spared the ordeal of a trial, though it could never spare them the pain of loss. On May 4, 2021, Gordon returned to court for sentencing. The judge heard about the circumstances of the murder, about the stabbing that had led to Phoenix's death, and about the horrific actions Gordon had taken afterward to conceal her crime. The judge heard about the dismemberment, the deception, the elaborate attempts to make people believe Phoenix was still alive while taking systematic steps to dispose of her body. Garika Kanita Gordon was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 23 years and 6 months before she could be considered for parole. The sentence reflected both the murder itself and the calculated, callous manner in which Gordon had attempted to cover it up. The judge who imposed the sentence had to consider not just the taking of Phoenix's life, but the sustained effort to deny her family answers and closure. Phoenix's family released a statement after the sentencing, expressing their gratitude to the police officers who had worked tirelessly on the investigation. They acknowledged that justice had finally been achieved for Phoenix, though they noted that the details of the case were extremely distressing for everyone who had known and loved her. The family specifically thanked the officers from both Gloucestershire Constabulary and West Midlands Police, recognizing that without their dedication and hard work, they might never have gotten justice or the answers they needed. For Phoenix's family in London, who had been expecting their daughter and loved one to return home, the discovery of her murder was devastating. Phoenix had been so close to leaving Birmingham, so close to reuniting with her family and starting fresh. Instead, she died just days before she planned to leave, killed by someone who lived in the same house, someone who should have been looking out for her rather than harming her. The question of why Gordon killed Phoenix may never be fully answered. Gordon's guilty plea meant there was no trial where evidence about motive would be extensively examined and debated. The court proceedings confirmed what happened and how Gordon had tried to conceal it. But the fundamental question of why she attacked Phoenix with a knife on that April day remains partially obscured. Did something specific trigger the violence, or had Gordon been planning it? The internet searches about stabbing recovery suggest she may not have intended for Phoenix to die, or at least had some uncertainty about whether the wounds would be fatal. But the subsequent dismemberment and elaborate cover-up showed determination to hide what she had done regardless of whether the killing itself was premeditated. Phoenix Nets deserved to live. She deserved to make it back to London, to reconnect with her family, to build the life she had been planning. Instead, she became a victim of violence in a multi-occupancy house during a pandemic lockdown, murdered by someone who then spent weeks pretending Phoenix was still alive while systematically disposing of evidence and her remains. The discovery of those suitcases near Stowfield Quarry on May 12, 2020, brought Phoenix's story into public view and set in motion the investigation that would ultimately bring some measure of justice. But justice cannot undo the fundamental tragedy that Phoenix Nets was killed when she should have lived, that her family received news of her death when they should have received her homecoming, and that a life full of potential ended at 28 in circumstances of unimaginable cruelty. Story 6. The evening of October 12, 2012, carried with it the particular energy that Friday nights often do, the promise of release from the work week and the anticipation of something pleasant ahead. For 29-year-old Ryan Carter Poston, an attorney who worked in Cincinnati, Ohio, that Friday held more than the usual promise. He had a date scheduled for 9:30 that night at a bar in Milford, Ohio, not with just anyone, but with Audrey Bolt, the reigning Miss Ohio USA. It was the kind of date that spoke to possibilities, to new beginnings, to moving forward from a relationship that had become increasingly toxic and exhausting over the previous 18 months. Ryan was preparing for the evening in his condominium in Highland Heights, Kentucky, a small suburb of Cincinnati, getting ready to meet someone who represented a future unburdened by the chaos that had defined too much of his recent past. Ryan Poston had not had an easy path to this moment of anticipation. Born on December 30th, 1982, in Fort Mitchell, Kentucky, to Lisa Carter and Jay Poston, Ryan had grown up with three younger sisters, Allison, Catherine, and Elizabeth, in a family that valued education and achievement. His childhood had taken him across the world, from Blessed Sacrament School in Fort Mitchell to the International School Manila in the Philippines and the International School of Geneva in Switzerland during his high school years. These experiences had shaped him into someone who understood different cultures and perspectives, someone who possessed both intelligence and worldliness. He had gone on to Indiana University, where his academic ambition manifested in a triple major in history, geography, and political science, graduating in 2005. From there, he attended Northern Kentucky University's law school in Highland Heights, earning his Juris Doctor degree and embarking on a career as an attorney. At 29, Ryan was precisely where he had worked so hard to be: professionally accomplished, financially stable, and on the cusp of what should have been the best years of his life. But a year and a half earlier, Ryan's life had become complicated in ways he had not anticipated. In 2011, when he was 28 years old, Ryan met a 20-year-old woman named Shayna Michelle Hubers on Facebook. She was friends with his step-cousin, Carissa Carlisle, and their connection seemed natural enough at first. Shayna was a psychology student at the University of Kentucky in Lexington, approximately 80 miles from Highland Heights, pursuing her education with apparent seriousness. She would eventually graduate with honors and begin working toward a master's degree in school counseling, credentials that suggested ambition and stability. But from the beginning, the relationship between Ryan and Shayna was volatile, marked by breakups and reconciliations, intense emotions and dramatic confrontations that left Ryan increasingly unsure about whether this was a relationship he wanted to continue. As the months passed, Ryan confided in family and friends that he wanted to end things with Shayna permanently. Ryan spoke with his stepfather, Peter Carter, about his upcoming date with Audrey Bolt. What should have been an exciting conversation was tinged with anxiety and fear. Ryan was afraid to tell Shayna about the date because he knew how she would react. This fear was not unfounded. Text messages between Ryan and his step-cousin Carissa Carlisle revealed that Ryan was actively trying to avoid conflict with Shayna, that he felt trapped in a cycle of drama and emotional manipulation. Yet despite his efforts to create distance, Shayna had a way of inserting herself back into his life, of refusing to accept that their relationship was over, of showing up uninvited and unwelcome. On that Friday evening in October, as Ryan prepared for his date with Audrey Bolt, Shayna was inside his Highland Heights condominium. The details of how she came to be there would become a matter of dispute and conflicting narratives. But what is undisputed is that at 8:53 p.m., approximately 40 minutes before Ryan was supposed to meet Audrey at the bar in Milford, Shayna called 911. Her voice on the recording carried emotion and distress as she reported to the dispatcher that she had just killed her boyfriend in self-defense. "I killed my boyfriend in self-defense," she said, her words tumbling out in what seemed like a mixture of panic and explanation. She told the dispatcher that she and Ryan had been arguing, that they had engaged in a physical confrontation, that he had thrown her across the room and attacked her. According to Shayna's account, she had been trying to gather her belongings from the apartment when Ryan became violent, and in fear for her life, she had grabbed his gun and shot him. The dispatcher stayed on the line with Shayna until officers from the Highland Heights Police Department arrived at the condominium just minutes later. When first responders entered the residence, they found a scene that would be seared into their memories and would become central evidence in the legal proceedings to come. Ryan Carter Poston lay on the floor of his condominium, blood pooling beneath his body. He had been shot 6 times with his own handgun. The autopsy would later reveal the locations of those 6 shots, a pattern of violence that seemed excessive even in the context of a self-defense claim. Ryan was deceased before emergency services could do anything to help him. His date with Audrey Bolt destined to remain forever unkept. His promising legal career cut short in the most brutal and final way possible. Detective Dave Fornash of the Highland Heights Police Department was one of the responding officers who arrived at the scene that night. After securing the scene and documenting the evidence, Fornash began the process of interviewing Shayna Hubers about what had happened. Though she had been read her Miranda rights, the legal advisement that she had the right to remain silent and to have an attorney present during questioning, Shayna voluntarily waived those rights and agreed to speak with police. What followed was hours of recorded interrogation that would ultimately become one of the most damning pieces of evidence against her. A window into her state of mind that revealed something far more disturbing than fear or trauma. During the interrogation, Shayna described Ryan as very vain, someone who was excessively concerned with his appearance. Then, in a moment that would be replayed countless times in courtrooms and media coverage, Shayna made a statement that seemed to reveal not remorse or horror at what she had done, but something closer to satisfaction. "I shot him right here," she said, pointing to her face. "I gave him the nose job he always wanted." The callousness of that remark, the dark humor in the face of having just taken a human life, struck everyone who heard it as profoundly inappropriate and deeply unsettling. It was not the comment of someone traumatized by having killed in self-defense, but rather of someone who seemed almost pleased with what she had done. As the hours of interrogation continued, Shayna's behavior became increasingly bizarre. She sang Amazing Grace at one point, her voice echoing in the stark interrogation room. She asked when she could call her mother, expressing concern about practical matters that seemed disconnected from the gravity of her situation. She wondered aloud whether anyone would ever want to marry her now that she had killed a boyfriend, even though she insisted it had been in self-defense. When left alone in the interrogation room for extended periods, Shayna began pacing, dancing around the space, and making statements to herself that would prove devastating to her defense. "I did it. Yes, I did it. I can't believe I did that," she said at one point, her voice captured by the recording equipment. Then, perhaps most damning of all, she said, "I'm so good at acting." These statements, made when she believed she was alone and unobserved, suggested a consciousness of guilt and a capacity for deception that undermined every claim she would later make about acting in justified self-defense. Shayna was arrested and charged with murder. Her bail was set at $3 million, an amount she could not meet, and she remained in the Campbell County Jail as the legal process slowly ground forward. On December 20th, 2012, she was formally indicted for Ryan Poston's murder. On January 16th, 2013, she entered a plea of not guilty. The case would not go to trial for more than 2 years, a period during which Ryan's family mourned the son and brother they had lost, struggled to understand why he had been taken from them, and waited for justice. Ryan Poston's funeral was held at Blessed Sacrament Church in Fort Mitchell, Kentucky, the same church where he had attended school as a child. A massive Christian burial celebrated a life that had been full of promise and potential. A young man who had been described as a loving son, caring grandson, and protective older brother. He was laid to rest in St. John's Cemetery in Fort Mitchell, his grave becoming a place where his family could come to remember the person he had been before violence stole him away. For Lisa Carter and Jay Poston, who had raised their son with such love and pride, and for his 3 younger sisters, the loss was incomprehensible. Ryan had been building a life, establishing a career, looking toward a future that should have included marriage, perhaps children, certainly decades more of experiences and growth. All of that had been erased in a matter of moments by someone who claimed to have loved him. When Shayna Hubers' trial finally began on April 13, 2015, the courtroom in Campbell County became the stage for a legal battle that would captivate local and national attention. Lead prosecutor Michelle Snodgrass presented the state's case methodically and powerfully, arguing that Shayna had not killed Ryan in self-defense, but had murdered him in cold blood because he wanted to end their relationship permanently. The prosecution presented text message evidence showing Shayna's obsession with Ryan, her refusal to accept that their relationship was over, her persistent intrusions into his life even when he made clear he wanted distance. The prosecution called witnesses whose testimony painted a picture of a controlling, manipulative woman who could not bear the thought of Ryan moving on to someone else, particularly not to someone like Audrey Bolt. Carissa Carlisle, Ryan's step-cousin and the person through whom he had met Shayna, testified about the text messages she had exchanged with Ryan before his death. She read aloud Ryan's expressions of frustration and his efforts to avoid conflict with Shayna, his desire to extricate himself from a relationship that had become exhausting and frightening. Peter Carter, Ryan's stepfather, testified about the conversation he had with Ryan just one day before the murder, in which Ryan confided about his upcoming date with Audrey Bolt and expressed fear about telling Shayna. This testimony established that Ryan was actively trying to move on with his life, that he saw a future without Shayna, and that this was precisely what had motivated her to kill him. Audrey Bolt herself took the stand, a poised and articulate witness who testified that she and Ryan had planned to meet at a bar in Milford, Ohio, at 9:30 on the night of October 12th. She had been looking forward to the date, she said, but Ryan never showed up. She had no way of knowing, as she waited at that bar, that Ryan was already gone, that the man she was supposed to be getting to know over drinks had been shot 6 times in his own home, less than an hour before they were supposed to meet. Perhaps the most damaging testimony came from Cecily Miller, a former cellmate of Shayna's who testified about conversations they had shared while awaiting trial. According to Miller, Shayna had bragged about killing Ryan, laughing about shooting him in the face and giving him the nose job he always wanted. Miller also testified that Shayna had discussed legal strategy with her, saying she had initially considered pleading insanity, but decided she was too smart because she has the IQ of Einstein, so she would instead claim battered woman syndrome. This testimony suggested cold calculation rather than genuine trauma, a woman who saw the legal system as a game to be manipulated rather than as a means of arriving at truth and justice. The defense team argued that Shayna had indeed acted in self-defense, that Ryan had been abusive throughout their relationship, and that she had feared for her life on the night she shot him. However, they chose not to have Shayna testify in her own defense, relying instead on the police interrogation tape in which she maintained her self-defense claim. This decision meant that jurors heard Shayna's voice describing the shooting, but also heard all of the disturbing comments she had made during those hours at the police station, including the nose job remark and her statement about being good at acting. On April 23, 2015, after 5 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with its verdict, guilty of murder. The jury recommended a sentence of 40 years in prison. Ryan's family embraced one another in the courtroom, tears streaming down their faces, relief mixed with the ongoing pain of their loss. 4 months later, on August 14, 2015, Shayna was formally sentenced to 40 years with parole eligibility after 20 years. The presiding judge made clear that he did not believe Shayna had been a victim of domestic violence, and that he had considered imposing an even longer sentence. But the case was not over. Shayna's attorneys filed an appeal, and on August 27, 2016, her conviction was overturned on a technicality. One of the jurors in her first trial had concealed a felony conviction, and Kentucky law prohibits convicted felons from serving on juries. A second trial was ordered, and after delays, it began on August 8, 2018. This time, Shayna took the stand in her own defense, providing detailed testimony about her relationship with Ryan. The defense again built its case around the claim that Ryan had been abusive, but the prosecution presented the same powerful evidence of premeditation and obsession. After 5 hours of deliberation, the second jury also found Shayna Hubers guilty of murder. On October 18, 2018, Judge Daniel Zala sentenced her to life imprisonment with parole eligibility after 20 years. Ryan's father, Jay Poston, spoke during the sentencing hearing, his voice breaking with emotion as he addressed the court. Evil, for reasons only it understands, decided to take from us what she could never have, he said. After the sentence was imposed, Ryan's mother, Lisa Carter, embraced those in the courtroom, saying through tears, "It's never over." She understood, as all who have lost loved ones to violence understand, that no sentence could truly provide closure, that Ryan would remain forever absent from their lives, and that the pain of his loss would never fully heal. Shayna Michelle Hubers is incarcerated at the Kentucky Correctional Institute for Women in Pewee Valley, Kentucky. She will be eligible for parole in 2032, having served 17 years of her sentence. Ryan Carter Poston remains buried in St. John's Cemetery in Fort Mitchell, his life and potential forever frozen at age 29. The case has been featured on numerous true crime television programs and podcasts, becoming one of those stories that captures public attention because of its elements of obsession, manipulation, and the deadly consequences of refusing to accept rejection. For Ryan's family, however, it is the permanent loss of someone they loved, the absence of a son and brother at family gatherings, the knowledge that Ryan never got to fulfill the promise of his education and talent, never got to meet Audrey Bolt at that bar in Milford, never got to experience the decades of life that should have stretched before him. The murder of Ryan Poston stands as a stark reminder that domestic violence can flow in any direction, that obsession can turn deadly, and that the inability to accept the end of a relationship can lead to irreversible tragedy. Story 7. Hollywood has always been a city of dreams, drawing hopeful souls from across the world who arrive with talent, determination, and a vision of stardom shimmering in their eyes. For 25-year-old Adea Shabani, the journey to Los Angeles represented the culmination of a lifelong aspiration. Born on March 16, 1992, in Macedonia during the final days of Yugoslavia, Adea grew up in a changing world, but her dreams remained constant. She was intelligent, ambitious, and beautiful, with striking features and an infectious energy that drew people to her. After attending an international school in Skopje, Macedonia's capital, she pursued higher education in Paris, earning a degree in business administration from the American University of Paris in 2014. But business was never her true passion. Acting was the fire that burned within her, the dream she had nurtured since childhood. After graduation, Adea took a practical approach to building her future, working at a jewelry store in Dubai and gaining real-world experience. But by 2016, she decided the time had come to pursue what she truly wanted. She moved to Los Angeles, the entertainment capital of the world, enrolling at the prestigious Stella Adler Academy of Acting. Adea threw herself into her studies, attending classes, rehearsing scenes, networking with fellow aspiring actors, and slowly building the foundation of a career. She landed a role in an independent short film, a small but meaningful step forward. She was set to graduate from the academy in September 2018, ready to launch herself fully into the competitive world of professional acting. Those who knew Adea described her as vibrant and communicative, someone who maintained constant contact with friends and family. She was an enthusiastic texter, always checking in, sharing updates about her life, asking questions, making plans. This consistent communication was simply part of who she was, a way of maintaining the connections that mattered to her even as she pursued her dreams thousands of miles from her homeland. At Stella Adler, Adea met Christopher Spots, a fellow student with his own acting aspirations. Spots, who stood about 5 feet 9 inches tall, maintained an athletic build and listed martial arts, yoga, and volleyball among his interests. His acting resume was modest, with appearances in 4 short films and 1 documentary between 2014 and 2018. But he was working toward building something more substantial, just like Adea. In September 2017, during a rehearsal of a scene, something shifted between them. Adea began seeing Spots differently, finding him interesting, recognizing his talent as an actor. A romantic relationship developed, intense and complicated from the very beginning. The complication was substantial. Christopher Spots was already engaged to another woman. Mary Elmalak, a nurse living in the Los Angeles area, had been in a relationship with Spots for years. They were planning a future together, or so Mary believed. ADA knew about Mary's existence, knew that the man she was falling for had made promises to someone else. Spots reportedly kept his relationship with ADEA hidden from their classmates and instructors at Stella Adler, maintaining separate lives with careful compartmentalization. Friends questioned ADEA's judgment, asking how she could trust someone who was engaged to another person. Her response revealed both her awareness of the drama and her acceptance of it. "You know how I love drama," she told one friend, who replied that this situation seemed like too much drama even for someone who thrived on it. The relationship between ADEA and Christopher followed a turbulent pattern, cycling between intensity and separation. By late December 2017, they had broken up. ADEA seemed to be accepting the end of the relationship, moving forward with her life. But by January 2018, they had reconciled. This time, according to what ADEA told friends, Christopher had proposed marriage. She began eagerly planning their wedding, envisioning a future with him. The couple made concrete plans to move in together, completing a lease application for a 2-bedroom apartment with a move-in date of March 1st, 2018. Friends also reported that around this time, ADEA confided that she might be pregnant with Christopher's child, adding another layer of complexity and commitment to their relationship. But beneath the surface of this whirlwind romance, troubling signs emerged that suggested something darker lurked in Christopher Spots' character. On Valentine's Day 2018, just 9 days before ADEA would disappear, Christopher spent time with both of his fiancées. He met Mary Elmalak in the morning, maintaining the illusion of their relationship, and then met ADEA later that evening at a restaurant. What happened that night would later take on sinister significance. ADEA told an ex-boyfriend that during dinner, she drank 2 glasses of wine and then blacked out. When she regained consciousness, she was at home and her phone was missing. Using the Find My iPhone app, she tracked the device to Christopher's residence. When she confronted him, Christopher allegedly made a joke that was anything but funny. He claimed she had passed out because he had choked her, and that when he brought her to the apartment, he thought she was dead. This disturbing incident should have served as a warning, a red flag waving frantically. But for reasons known only to her, ADEA continued the relationship. Perhaps she believed his explanation, perhaps she minimized the incident, or perhaps the excitement and drama she admitted to craving clouded her judgment about the danger she was in. Whatever her reasoning, she remained with Christopher Spots in the days that followed, planning their future together even as that future was rapidly running out of time. Friday, February 23, 2018, began as what appeared to be an ordinary day. Around noon, security cameras in ADEA's Hollywood apartment building captured footage that would become crucial evidence in the investigation that followed. The elevator surveillance video showed ADEA and Christopher together, both wearing baseball caps. ADEA carried 2 suitcases, as though preparing for a trip. The timestamp on the video read 12:48 p.m., marking one of the last confirmed sightings of ADEA Shabani alive. Around the same time, ADEA sent a text message asking where she could buy red candles. This seemingly mundane question represented her final communication with the outside world. By 12:50 p.m., all activity on ADEA's phone ceased. For someone who texted constantly, who maintained regular contact with friends and family, this sudden silence was dramatically out of character. But the silence went unnoticed at first, lost in the ordinary rhythms of a Friday afternoon. Christopher had told ADEA they were traveling to Northern California for the funeral of his uncle. It seemed like a reasonable explanation for the suitcases, for the trip, for everything. But when investigators later contacted Christopher's family, they learned a disturbing truth. Christopher Spots did not have an uncle who had recently passed away. The funeral was a fiction, a lie constructed to get ADEA into a vehicle with him, trusting and unsuspecting. As Friday turned into Saturday, and then Sunday, ADEA's friends and family began to worry. She wasn't responding to calls or texts. This wasn't like her at all. When Monday arrived and ADEA missed an important acting class at Stella Adler. The first day roles were being assigned for an upcoming production. Alarm bells began ringing loudly. ADEA was serious about her education, committed to her craft, excited about opportunities. Missing this class was inexplicable unless something was terribly wrong. On February 25th, 2 days after she was last seen, ADEA Shabani was officially reported missing to the Los Angeles Police Department. Detectives immediately began investigating, and Christopher Spotts, as the last person seen with ADEA, became their primary focus. When questioned, Christopher provided a statement that initially seemed plausible. He claimed that he and ADEA had indeed traveled together to Northern California, but they had gotten into an argument during the drive. According to his account, he dropped her off along the side of a freeway in Santa Clarita, just 25 miles from her residence, and drove away. He insisted that was the last time he saw ADEA Shabani. Detectives worked to verify this story, checking surveillance cameras, interviewing witnesses, and analyzing phone records. But as the investigation progressed, they found nothing that corroborated Christopher's version of events. No security footage showed ADEA in Santa Clarita. No witnesses reported seeing her. Her phone activity had ceased around the time Christopher arrived at her apartment, and it never resumed. The story simply didn't hold up under scrutiny. Meanwhile, ADEA's disappearance became a community cause. Her mother traveled from Macedonia to Los Angeles, desperate for any information about her daughter. The streets of Hollywood were plastered with missing person flyers featuring ADEA's photograph. A $25,000 reward was offered for information regarding her whereabouts. On March 10, 2018, volunteers organized a search of a Northern California forest, hoping to find some trace of the missing actress. They found nothing. ADEA's 26th birthday passed on March 16th without any sign of her. The days turned into weeks, and hope began to fade. As detectives continued investigating, they discovered more troubling details about Christopher Spotts' life. Not only was he engaged to 2 women simultaneously, but he was also driving a stolen vehicle, a Toyota Tacoma that became the subject of an arrest warrant. This was the same truck he had used to drive away with ADEA on the day she disappeared. On March 21, 2018, Christopher and Mary Elmalak left Los Angeles, driving to Mary's parents' home in Fort Morgan, Colorado. Whether Mary knew about ADEA's disappearance or Christopher's involvement is unclear, but the timing suggested Christopher was attempting to distance himself from the investigation. The following day, March 22, 2018, events took a dramatic turn. Authorities issued an alert for Christopher Spotts' stolen Toyota Tacoma. California Highway Patrol officers spotted the vehicle and attempted a traffic stop in Riverside County, east of Los Angeles in the Inland Empire region. Christopher did not pull over. Instead, he led officers on a chase along the freeway. The pursuit was brief but telling. The actions of someone who knew capture meant consequences he wasn't willing to face. Christopher eventually exited the freeway, bringing his truck to a stop. But before officers could reach him, before they could take him into custody and question him about ADEA Shabani's disappearance, Christopher Spotts raised a gun to his own head and pulled the trigger. He died at the scene. With the primary suspect dead, the investigation took on a different character. Detectives could no longer question Christopher, could no longer press him for the truth about what happened to ADEA. His suicide strongly suggested guilt, but it left many questions unanswered. Where was ADEA? What had happened to her? Had Christopher acted alone, or had someone helped him? 5 days after Christopher's death, on March 27, 2018, those questions received partial answers in the worst possible way. Authorities discovered a shallow grave in a remote area of the Sierra Nevada foothills in Nevada County, Northern California. The location was more than 400 miles from ADEA's Hollywood apartment, in the Woods Wildlife area near Wheatland, an isolated region of wilderness far from major population centers. The recovery of the remains was described as a slow and painstaking process, with investigators working carefully to preserve any evidence that might explain what had happened. The remains had been positively identified as those of Adea Shabani, aided by distinctive tattoos on her body. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma to the head. Adea's death was classified as a homicide. Captain Hayes told reporters that detectives believed Adea had been dead for more than a month, meaning she had likely been killed shortly after she disappeared on February 23rd. With Adea's body found and Christopher dead, the LAPD officially considered the case closed, believing Christopher Spotts was responsible for her murder. But this conclusion, while legally sufficient, left profound questions unanswered. What exactly had happened during those hours after Christopher picked up Adea from her apartment? Had he killed her immediately, or had she endured a period of captivity and fear before her death? Why had he chosen that specific burial location in the Sierra Nevada foothills? And perhaps most troubling, had Christopher acted alone? One of the most significant breakthroughs came from technology that Christopher Spotts probably never considered. While phone data had failed to provide detailed location information, Christopher's Google account told a different story. It turned out that Christopher never turned off his phone or disabled location services, meaning Google had been tracking his movements with extraordinary precision, down to the minute and the exact location. Christopher's family, now devastated by the loss of their son and desperate to understand what had happened, agreed to turn over his digital footprint to Strauss and Detective Brandt. The Google location data provided a minute-by-minute account of Christopher's movements on February 23, 2018. The data showed him arriving at Adea's apartment at 12:48 p.m., exactly when the elevator surveillance footage captured them together. Adea's phone activity stopped at 12:50 p.m., just 2 minutes after Christopher arrived. Investigators theorized that Christopher either asked Adea to turn off her phone or did it himself, eliminating her ability to communicate or be tracked. The data then tracked Christopher's route out of Los Angeles, heading north toward the Sierra Nevada region. Critically, the location data placed Christopher's phone in the exact area where Adea's body would later be discovered, providing strong evidence of his involvement in both her murder and burial. But the Google data also revealed something that complicated the narrative of Christopher acting alone. The data showed that Christopher made stops at locations that raised new questions. Strauss and Detective Brandt identified visits to a hardware store and to an apartment building in North Hollywood before Christopher picked up Adea. What was he doing at these locations? Did he meet someone? Did he purchase supplies? The hardware store stop was particularly troubling because it suggested premeditation. Christopher may have been gathering tools or materials before committing murder. Even more disturbing were allegations that emerged from the investigation, suggesting Christopher may have had help with the burial. According to information shared in online discussions of the case, Christopher's biological father, Chris Spotts Sr., who lived in Wheatland, California, just 10 miles from where Adea's body was found, may have been involved. The father admitted to choosing the burial site, holding a flashlight while his son dug the shallow grave, and helping to move Adea's body from the truck where Christopher had wrapped it in a blanket. If true, this would mean Christopher had called his father after killing Adea, driven her body hundreds of miles north, and received assistance in concealing the crime. These allegations were never proven in court because Christopher's death meant no trial ever took place. No criminal charges were filed against Christopher's father. The lack of prosecution left a void where answers should have been, a frustration for Adea's family and friends who deserved to know the full truth of what happened to her. The Los Angeles Police Department officially closed the case, satisfied that Christopher Spotts was responsible for Adea Shabani's murder. Detective Luis Brandt acknowledged the uniqueness of the situation. Both a homicide and a suicide meant they could never question their primary suspect, never hear his confession or understand his full motivations. The case was resolved in the sense that they knew who killed Adea, but it would never be truly complete because so many questions remained unanswered. Christopher's family found themselves in an impossible position, mourning a son while grappling with evidence that he had committed murder. Their decision to cooperate with investigators and turn over Christopher's digital footprint demonstrated a commitment to truth, even when that truth was devastating. As Neil Strauss noted, 2 families had been destroyed by what happened. ADEA's family lost a beloved daughter, and Christopher's family lost a son while learning he was capable of terrible violence. For those who knew ADEA, the loss extended beyond her immediate family. Friends from the Stella Adler Academy remembered a talented classmate who was on the verge of achieving her dreams. The instructors who had worked with her mourned a student who would never graduate, never perform the roles they had helped her prepare for. The case is officially closed, but for ADEA's family, there will never be true closure. There is only the permanent absence of a daughter who should still be alive, an actress who should have graduated from Stella Adler in September 2018, a young woman who deserved the opportunity to pursue her dreams and build the life she had envisioned. Instead, she became another victim of violence, another life cut short, another story that ended far too soon and far too brutally in a shallow grave in the wilderness.